secure teams and information within teams. I have given a copy of this deck to Steve to post. So I have links in here that you guys can go back later on and look at and get further information. Okay. So we're going to be looking at some of these topics, actually all of these topics on this call. There's a lot to cover. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat and I'll try to address them as we go along. So first thing, Teams, and I want to just talk about this really briefly because, we all kind of know what Teams is, right? It's a collaboration platform where you can use it to chat, to meet, call, share files. But one of the things that people don't really talk about is what Teams is not, right? Teams is not a standalone application. Teams has a very large backend that is Office 365. And that's important to remember because Office 365 has a lot of security in itself. And we use those tools within the suite to secure and layer on security all over the environment. You see here, chat is actually stored inside of the user's mailbox. If it's a one-on-one chat, channel messages, whether it's general or individual team messages, are stored inside of a group mailbox that's created with the Office 365 group, and so on and so forth. It's important to remember this because as we start to go along and talk about the tools, you're going to leverage different tools depending on where the information you're trying to block or access lives. For instance, the files that belong to a user, that file section on the left-hand side of the navigation is actually part of OneDrive for Business. So when we talk about accessing information, I generally divide it up in a couple different ways. It's really just controlling access to the team and controlling access to a group. One of the most common misconceptions that I've seen, and one of the most common questions I get, revolves around external user versus a guest user. So quite simply put, external access or external users are users that live in another organization that you want to chat, call, or set up meetings with. Now, I mentioned another organization because it's important to delineate. These are not anonymous users. These are users that have a Teams environment, that have another Microsoft tenant out there, and we trust them. So similar to what we used to do when we used to set up the connectors between organizations for email or Skype, we actually trust all Microsoft organizations by default, unless you go into the Teams admin center and manually change it. In this example, I've added the Microsoft domain as a allowed domain. When you set this up this way, it actually blocks all other domains from accessing you and you accessing them. This is a whitelist scenario, so you have to remember that when you do this, you have to then manage all whitelists. You can also do the opposite and add block sites and blacklist them, which then allows everybody but that blacklisted site. But again, by default, all tenants are allowed and are connected or federated. With guest access, and this is an important one to mention, this is why I wanted to make sure that we spend a little bit of time here. Guests are not just guests of the team. When you invite a guest to the team, yes, they are members of that team, and they see pretty much everything that a normal standard user of that team sees. But they're also a guest of the tenant. An actual user is created inside of Azure Active Directory. And that's something that we have to remember because those users, depending on how Azure Active Directory is configured, can be almost as powerful as a standard user. Now, the guest setting inside of Teams is an organization-wide setting. It's either on or off for the whole org. But we can control how and who can control Teams depending on the use case. For example, if you want to prevent general users from creating teams, you would turn on the guest inviter, the guest access inside of Teams and then you would go into Azure Active Directory, and I'll show these settings in a second, and only allow administrators or people with a guest inviter role, it's an Azure Active Directory role, the ability to create or add people to teams. We can also use sensitivity labels, similar to what we use in DLP, to prevent external users from being added to teams. And I have information through that link here for that. This is what the settings panel looks like inside of Azure Active Directory. You'll see here that these are the settings that can be, and again, these are org-wide, so they apply to all guests. You can see that we have different options here when it comes to, for instance, delineating the directory. By default, all users are able to delineate any user in the directory. So a guest user by default, when they're added to a team, can technically do a search for the superintendent, for a dean, for somebody in the directory and communicate with them. We can change that and make it more restrictive, and that would allow that user to only see users within the team that they were invited to. The section below is where you will decide who can invite people to teams. If we set members to not be able to invite people, then only administrators or guest inviters can invite guests to teams. It's important to note that when a user leaves a team, so if a guest user leaves the team, they're not deleted from Azure Active Directory. So you do have to do a little bit of manual work there to make sure that you manage that. Another way that we start to secure the environment is through group options inside of Azure Active Directory. So as I mentioned earlier, teams are actually Office groups in the backend. This is how we separate and how we manage the team's environment is through groups. And one of the ways we can leverage securing the environment is through naming policies. You don't normally think about naming policies as a security, but think about a way of preventing fraud. So one of the most common scenarios that I see, especially in the higher ed front, is them not wanting to make sure that a student doesn't create a team called financial aid or bursar's office, where the person can leverage that to get credit cards, social security numbers, what have you. So by creating a naming policy, you can automatically create a prefix based on criteria. In this case, I have attribute, and then I decided to use department as my criteria. So if I, as a student, and let's say as a student, I have the name student in my department field on my user, the moment I create a team, it's going to show student and then the team name that I selected. And that makes it easier for people to identify what's an institutional-based team and what was user created. Going further, we can also enable a block list that allows for us to automatically block users creating teams that have these words in them. So something like financial aid would be included in that list, and then only administrators would be able to create those teams. Expiration of groups is another area that we have to always pay attention to. So one of the most common ways that I've seen of people kind of losing track of the data that's out there is to just let these teams live forever. On top of that, things get a little messy in the environment. So you want to try to keep things to automatically cleaning themselves up. Expiration of groups is one of the best ways of doing this. By setting a time to live for that group, it will remind or ask the team owners to review whether or not the group has to continue to live. In this case, for instance, I have it at 180 days. It starts to ask the team owner, is this still around? Do I still need to use this? If the team is in constant use, it actually does not bother the team owner. It's only when the team hasn't been used in a while. If the team needs to continue to live, the team owner just clicks renew and everything keeps working. If nobody responds, the team is automatically archived and later deleted. Teams that are archived can be recovered, but once they're deleted, they're gone. Another way of controlling access to groups is via access review. Okay. We have questions here. We enable expiration. Will all existing groups? No. So you can actually target those policies to specific groups if you like. And it's only on lack of use. So it's never, you're never going to have them all at the same time. It's, if a team hasn't been used in a year, or this team's been used in a month, they're definitely going to stagger depending on their utilization. And like I said, you can target the expiration to specific teams. So not everybody will be at the same time. So access review is an interesting one because we can leverage it for a couple of different ways. You can leverage it to make sure that guests are not in a team longer than they need to be. Access review when it's set up, will force the owner to review all of the members of the team. And if the owner doesn't respond, remove either guests, if it's set up as guests, or all users of the team altogether. So this is an important piece to kind of think about, because it helps you as an administrator to automate the process, and really forces the owner of the team to own that team and own the memberships. I think there was a question that Steve sent me last week about someone that's using lab services through Teams, and they wanted to know, what suggestions were out there in managing it. This is one that I would use in that scenario. If I have teams that are or people that are invited, members that are invited to a team that use the lab services, you obviously don't want them to be there forever and potentially spin up a computer when they don't need to be there. So an access review gives that owner the ability to go in and, once a month or whatever you set it up to be the access, to go in there, review, remove the users that don't need to be there, or remove them automatically. Let's say at the end of a term, for instance, they're all gone. They don't have access anymore. They're not spending institutional money. As I mentioned, we have the ability to change this so that we can do an access review weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually. You really get a lot of flexibility as to how often that review happens, and then you get the control of whether you want to either remove access or do nothing and audit. Now, this again, you can target just the same as expirations. You can target it to groups, so that you can control who gets what. Maybe you don't want access reviews on everything, or maybe you do. You have the flexibility to do either or. Akash, so we want to have expiration to all teams minus specific teams. There's no setting for all and then exclusion. You'll have to include all the ones you want to expire. The next level of this is securing the information that's inside of Teams. So Steve already posted a link to the DLP side of the house. DLP is important because it helps us to secure information that might be leaked by mistake. Let's use that guest access as an example earlier. Let's say you invited a guest into a team and you're chatting with one of your coworkers. You're not realizing what team you're sitting in when you send something like a credit card number or a social security number in that team as a chat. And now you have a guest that could potentially take that information and use it. If DLP is enabled, that information will be blocked from the eyes of that guest, as it's considered to be sensitive information. Inside of Teams, we can also use DLP to block things like offensive words. We use that in a lot of K-12 school districts, where we feed it a list of blocked words, and if it comes up, if a student types a bad word in there that matches one of those words, that word is blocked. The other students don't see it, and an administrator is notified. Now, this is great, and it's something that's definitely necessary, but it is limited to a static list of words. If a user adds a letter, adds a number, it doesn't help. So communication compliance was designed to allow machine learning to help us with some of this stuff. Now, while DLP will detect and block, today communication compliance will detect and report and allow you to remediate manually. So the idea here is it's going to send a review of what was happening up to an administrator that's determined by the IT admin, and that administrator it would investigate and remediate. The nice thing here, though, is that where DLP is going to be very specific in the words or in the templates, if it's something that's for instance, credit cards and stuff like that, where it's a templatized detection. Here, it's using machine learning. So let's use that offensive language example that I used earlier. If I write, "I'm hurt by what you said," it's not necessarily a bad thing. The filter would see it and move on and not bother you. However, if I say, "I'm going to hurt you," that same word now has a different meaning. Communication compliance would flag that as an abuse and notify an administrator. It will also flag not just written word or text, but if I were to write a Giphy, if I actually make a meme that has a bad word in it, it actually will do image recognition and OCR so that it sees the bad word inside the meme, detects it, and notifies. It also does flesh recognition so that we also recognize nudity. Now, everything that I've shown you today so far has been mainly blocking access or blocking things that are in stream. It's important to note that layering protection, as I mentioned earlier, since we have this entire massive suite of security products that can layer on top of this, Azure Information Protection is another vital piece, because not only can we at this point block what's within Teams, but we're blocking documents that could pass through Teams and end up somewhere else. So by being able to classify and even automatically label documents that have sensitive information, we can prevent further leakage or further spread of that document. I've seen documents that landed on a thumb drive that had AIP on them, and that person took that thumb drive away from the data center, plugged it into their home computer, and still couldn't access it because they didn't have the right credentials for it. Very powerful tool. It's something that everyone should definitely look at. So this is one of those areas that I mentioned earlier where we have to pay attention to where certain data lives, because when we start to do investigations, it's going to be important that we think about that very, very deeply. Retention is an area we have to talk about really quick, because one of the things that people don't realize is that if you have retention policies today for Exchange and SharePoint, that retention policy does not cover Teams. So if you have a new Teams environment, you have to go into the retention policies and create a new retention policy for Teams. It cannot be the same retention policy. It will actually, if you click on Teams, it'll turn off all the rest and vice versa. So you have to create a separate retention policy specifically for Teams chat and Teams channel messages. If you want to do any kind of retention on files, we have to remember that files inside of a channel or inside of a team live in SharePoint. So we have to make sure that is has a retention policy. And files that belong to the user are part of OneDrive for Business. So we have to make sure that is a retention policy. All of this together is what we need if you want to be able to retain data across the environment in Teams. Now, legal hold is a different animal. Legal hold is for Teams is in a different area than legal hold for SharePoint and Exchange. And I do have a link to that information in that previous slide where the links are. It is important to note that it does cover different things in Exchange. So when you put a legal hold, you can place a legal hold on an entire team or on the individual users, and all communications between those users will be held. E-discovery is also available through the security and compliance portal, similar to what you have in Exchange, with the exception of private channels. So any kind of e-discovery that's required for private channels does take place in a different location. I did link to the bottom of there, but we do we leverage the content search inside of Azure Active Directory for e-discovery and private channels. Obviously, we're here in education, so student safety is a concern, and there's a couple different places here that I want to look at when it comes to student safety. The first one's going to be information barriers. This is a very common request in education. A lot of times, either administrators don't want students to reach out to them. In the universities, especially, you want the deans and those folks to not be bothered by students. So we can use information barriers to isolate groups and not allow communication. Now, this is different from the Exchange address book rules that we have in the past, where it's just going to stop a user from finding the person or searching for the person. This does, by the way, use the address book rules. So that's one area that we have to pay attention to. If you have address book rules in your environment today, they have to be removed in order to turn on information barriers. But information barriers will not just stop a person from searching, it'll actually also block the communication between those groups. Information barrier policies are evaluated every time a member is added to a team, a new chat's requested, users are added to a group chat, or users invited to a meeting. Now, I think we're all familiar with bombing by now. It's a phrase that started back when the pandemic kind of kicked off and people started using all the online meetings, surprise guests in meetings that weren't supposed to be there, and start causing disruption. A lot of that happened because organizations were leaving anonymous meetings on, and it happens a lot more often than we think, because you want to be able to leverage your meeting application to meet with anybody. Think of a teacher that wants to meet with a parent. Well, that parent doesn't have a Teams tenant, so they can't join a meeting as an external user. They're going to come in as anonymous. So what we've done in Teams is that we've made some changes that help to kind of be a gatekeeper for those teachers, so that instead of just allowing everybody into a meeting and potentially having an issue with bombing, now what we do is you can either by default as a tenant setting, set only the organizer to bypass the lobby, and then everybody else is waiting for the organizer to reach the lobby and invite people in. Or the teacher can have the flexibility to do that as part of the individual meeting options. Now, that does have to be changed after the meeting is created. So the teacher would have to create the meeting and then go into the meeting options and change that to only me, so that the teacher can bypass the lobby and force everybody to stay in the lobby until they're ready. And that can help you to determine who are supposed to be there and who are not. If a teacher has to kick a student or kick a person out of the meeting, that person is put back in the lobby where they can no longer disrupt. Opening the floor to more questions.
Hey, thanks, Carlos. All right, guys, any questions? Doesn't have to be about this. It could be about anything security related. We're here for you. Oh, thanks, Steve. So there was a couple questions in there, and I don't know if we got them all answered or if there was one where somebody said have a flow post to the unit team every expiration days -1. And I think it was around, can we disable expiration on specific teams? I don't know if you answered that question or not.
Yeah, I have to look at that flow. I've never tried to use flow to
But as a
affect
team's admin,
expirations.
can a team's admin go in and just say remove an expiration date for a specific team so it never expires?
It's not a setting that's in the group settings for expiration.
Okay.
Well, I guess you technically could put a hold on it, and it would never go away.
Well, that's true.
I
I
guess
know
that
inside of like security groups through Graph API, we can go in and set
well,
the expiration to 0.
it is possible to do it through Graph. I normally stay away from recommending people go into Graph.
Okay.
It is a dangerous place to live.
Yes, Eric, I will have the deck posted. I know, Carlos, you'd sent me a PDF version. I don't know if you can send me the PowerPoint version as well.
I can send you both. The
Okay.
PDF that I sent you does have live links, so those links do work.
There's a few more questions rolling in now. All right, that's fine.
So sensitivity labels already exist. We have here. Let me pull this up here. Early. Here you go. I have a browser that you don't have, that I don't. I'm not sharing. So you do have the ability to set sensitivity labels, although they mainly are. Well, okay. Let me ask this question: what are you looking for? Because
and you guys can come off mute as well.
Yeah, please do.
Hey, thanks. I'd like that to kind of flow through to like retention policy concepts. Is there a way to have a user who sets up a team, apply a label or sensitivity label to their team and have that in the background enable some retention policies for them?
So it is possible to one, set up retention policies on SharePoint libraries. It's also possible for you to create an Azure information protection policy and apply that to a team and or SharePoint library as well, so that any document that goes in there would automatically have that label applied to it. With our compliance package, you do have the ability of creating retention labels and applying Azure information protection policies at the same time as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you want, just ping me afterwards or put a message in the office hour team, and I'll get you more information and link that out for you there. So Eric said, very nice. Could you please post? Yes, we're going to do that.
I see a question from Raj. Group expirations applicable to Office 365 groups, including dynamic? No, dynamic are rules based, so that they would not be affected by expiration.
So there's a question that's off topic, which is fine. Regarding something different, Azure AD conditional access policies. Has anyone accomplished adding Duo MFA to all services except for OneDrive to allow for silent OneDrive login? We have been testing using Azure AD conditional access policies, but haven't found the right mix to still require Duo for Exchange and Teams. I have to look in there to see if we're actually splitting SharePoint from OneDrive inside of conditional access. I know we do inside of Microsoft Cloud App Security. I don't know if that functionality has ever moved over into Azure Active Directory from a conditional access perspective. I know for the longest time, and it might still be that way, I haven't looked at it in a while, since OneDrive is built on top of SharePoint, we're just grouping them all together from that side of the house. And I'll have to take a look at that. John says, anyone else making use of the AD/ADFS connector for notifications for the failed authentication from risky events address? I'm not, but hopefully there's other people out there that are. If you have a specific question, John, definitely post that in the team and we can get back to you, or have some of your peers answer that for you. FYI, there's a known issue with Duo for external accounts. Does Duo's Microsoft Azure Active Directory conditional access application work with external guest accounts? It should, and the reason why I say it should is because really what you're doing from the Duo side is you're going to go to Duo, you're going to say, hey, I want to use this inside of Azure AD, and they're going to give you a JSON. Inside of you're going to copy that JSON and go and create a custom connector and put that in there. And then really what you're going to do is create a conditional access policy. And in the conditional access policy, you're going to say this pertains to external users. And you're going to say, mine is called Duo MFA that I have inside of my Azure AD tenant. And all we're going to do is say, okay, this is an external user. All the conditions are met for conditional access to require a Duo, and we're going to hand that call off to Duo. So I don't know. I guess there's a link here.
Yeah, we tested that and it doesn't work. So just people that are using that, it's a known thing, I guess.
Oh, okay.
The format, yeah. It kind of threw us for a loop because we were planning on using it for guest accounts as well.
Gotcha.
We do have it working just fine for normal.
So the other thing that you can do too is if you're going to use it for guest accounts, unless you're going to have them set up Duo in other places outside of Azure AD, you can just use Azure MFA in there and you're licensed to use that. This way you're not incurring any costs from the Duo side, and you can create a multiple conditional access policy, one for your guest users, one for your internal users, and where internal ones are being called Duo and the external ones will be calling for an Azure MFA.
Yeah, our use case was we have 2 tenants in our university, and between the 2, we're using the same Duo system.
Okay.
So it would be a subset of our guests, right, that is the other tenant that are already enrolled in Duo. And then normal guests, we would do MFA. So now we're just having to do MFA for our internal folks, which is kind of weird, but I don't know if there are other options.
Oh, I see. Because when I understand what the problem is now by reading this, when you create a guest user, it's not coming in as stshoals@microsoft.com. It's coming in as stshoals.microsoft.com, hashtag external, whatever, bunch of stuff behind it. And we're probably passing that entire block off to them. So when you actually look at the external username or inside of Azure AD, it's not what Duo is expecting, and that's probably why it's getting a little flubbed up there. Scott said, using the prevent bombing, describe the best setting to promote an open job fair.
Well, that word open is kind of a problem. That's going to be difficult. I mean, you could do something like that and just have somebody at the quote unquote door to make sure. But at the end of the day, if you're opening it up to the world, anybody can join. That's a little difficult.
Yeah, the idea behind that was can you still do leave it an open and deny presenter, deny chat, deny video, and then be able to still somehow allow them to chat. Is that part of the webinar feature that might work to, instead of a meeting, to allow them to chat and then move that person to a breakout room with an HR person to further the discussion outside of the meeting?
Yeah, you absolutely could do that.
But you can't do breakout rooms in webinar, correct?
No, it has to be a Teams meeting.
Yeah.
How big a meeting are we talking about?
Well, until they got bombed. It was about 12,000.
Oof.
Yeah, that's big.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't know if there's any other way of doing that.
Mhm. Yeah.
And a live meeting doesn't offer breakout rooms, so you wouldn't have that ability.
Yeah, so you'd have to create an invite to that person at that moment to break them out into a separate meeting from
Right.
a live event. Chat with them individually. Okay. Thank you.
Eric has a question about sensitivity labels. The article that I posted here doesn't actually mention EDU not being supported. But Eric, if you want to send me an email later on, I will. I'll find out.
Trying to see if there's any other questions. Oh, there's a new message. Oh, he posted the link in there, second paragraph. Yes, this is a known thing. We're working on the documentation. So we'll get back to you inside of our team chat. When we, I'll look in to see if we got any further information on this and see what's going on here. All right, I guess if we have no further questions, anybody who wants to come off mute and share anything with the community, or have any other questions, any other conversation, this is the time to do it. I don't want everybody just sitting here with idle time if we're not going to do anything. All right, I guess at that point we'll call it a wrap. Thank everybody for showing up. Seeing everybody in 2 weeks. If you have any ideas for the next session, please let us know, and we will do our best to accommodate that. And I thank everybody for showing up, and everybody stay safe and stay healthy.
Thanks, everyone.